Good afternoon and welcome everybody to this first what we call Julie and Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory Conversation of this year, 2024. Today's topic is extreme events and their impact on our world's future. The event is part of an ongoing series of conversations that we hold around topics that are timely, and they are used to illuminate what they mean for us, but also to showcase some of the expertise that we have in the Global Futures Laboratory around these topics. And it's an opportunity to hear from our experts how they actually see these topics or the events that are discussed in these topics influence how we are living today and how we might live in the future. So, as I said, today we are dealing with extremes, and that's probably no surprise to all of you why we picked that. If we are looking back at 2023, we actually saw an increasing number of extreme events. We also saw an increase in environmental conditions, or in the extent to which environmental conditions have an influence on our life. So the most prominently discussed probably at this point is the global average temperature increase, the increase of the surface air temperature, which according to the European assessment by Copernicus was 1.48 degrees Celsius. If you use the same baseline and use the data of the Goddard Institute of Space Study out of the US, you get to 1.42. You all know that this essentially is 1.5. You also know that 1.5 has a special meaning because we actually tried hard to stay at or below 1.5 degree warming as part of agreements such as the Paris Accord, but also the assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 1.5 degree report suggested that staying at or below that level would be advantageous moving forward. We knew since quite a while that we would blow through that barrier or through that threshold. It was nevertheless surprising how fast we reached that. Now that doesn't mean we will stay at or above 1.5 from here on out. We are, after all, living in a complex system, so things are going up and down. But the fact that we made that kind of move, even considering that we are in an El Niño year where temperatures are typically higher, is another warning sign that we are overtaxing our planet. But then going to what you really would call extreme events, and you can use your preferred definition what an extreme event is. Typically, it is characterized by hitting part of a spectrum that's in the upper or lower 5 or 10% of the normal range. So looking at events that fall into that category, we had quite a bit in 2023. For example, on the wildfire side, we had Maui, Hawaii. We had a flood in Eastern Libya that took the life of about 4,000 people. We had, of course, close to home here, or at home, to use that more accurately, we had 31 days, consecutive days, of heat above 110 Fahrenheit. Those of you who are still like myself thinking in Celsius, that's 43.3 Celsius. That's pretty hot, actually. And if you went to the northern part of the country, quite frequently actually, you saw the smoke from wildfires from Canada. And you didn't just see it, you also could smell it. And these are just a few examples of an increasing number of extremes that we are seeing around the globe. More locations, more types, and higher amplitudes. Now, looking at where we are right now, we actually have records in cold conditions and icy conditions and snow, which always is, of course, an interesting situation because those who are still a bit on the climate denying side use these events to say, so much about global warming, what are you telling us? Well, the fact that we see these conditions that are below normal in terms of temperature and conditions does not mean that 2024 will not be another warm year. So we have to also learn, as we are looking at extremes, to look at averages and put them into the right into the right context. So what is important as we are seeing these events is to figure out how can we actually anticipate them, how can we get prepared, and how can we respond to them. So a lot of the effort that we have to embark on is disaster preparedness and response. And that will be part of our conversation today, among other topics. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers today, our participants in the conversation. To my left, we have Kelly Barr, who has joined us about 4 months ago or something like that.
2.5.
2.5, okay.
Time flies, Peter.
Time flies, okay. So Kelly is the Associate Vice President and Chief Alliance Officer of the Global Futures Laboratory. Before that, for about 3 decades, she was a leading executive in SAP, the Salt River Project, where she worked as chief in the areas of chief strategy, corporate services, and sustainability. Kelly is an active leader in energy, environmental, and business groups, and she has received numerous awards, including the 2022 Woman of the Year recognition from the Arizona Capital Times. Next to Kelly, we have Jennifer Vanos. Jennifer, as most of you know Jennifer, she's an associate professor in climate and human health at the School of Sustainability. Her research addresses adaptation to extreme heat in a changing climate and the impacts of extreme heat and air pollution on human health. She's the primary investigator of the Human Biometeorology Laboratory at ASU, and she also chairs the American Meteorological Society's Board on Environment and Health. We have on the screen over here, and I think now it's coming up twice, so it should be over here too, right? Upmanu Lal, who is a Global Futures Professor who started even more recently than Kelly, January 1. But just to give us a sense of how it is to work in extreme environments, Manu put himself into extreme conditions with big earpods and glasses and still having the Christmas tree behind him. So I think he's really ready for the discussion of extremes. Manu's work ranges across a wide spectrum, going from basic research on hydroclimatology. That's how I got to know him a few decades ago. And he is also looking at applied research on systems design, optimization, nonlinear dynamics, complexity, policy analysis, and innovation. Before joining us, he resided permanently where he is right now. I see, Manu, you're in your office in the Mud Building at Columbia University. So with that, please join me in giving our panelists a warm welcome, and then we will go into the questions. So starting with Manu, so that we get a sense if he's actually hearing us and we can hear him. So Manu, we are in states of transition in many parts of the Earth system. Mostly we talk about weather, but of course there are transitions in many parts of the Earth, virtually in all of them. And these transitions do include secular changes, but then they are overprinted by abrupt changes and extremes. In the context of that, why are extremes so difficult to deal with?
So I think the point is that in many cases, people do planning for what they are used to. And so extremes, since they happen rarely, 5 or 10% of the time, as you said, people forget. And today, what's starting to happen is that the extremes are becoming the normal for climate in some ways, but also for other things in society. If you look at the way the stock market behaves, you often wonder what kind of records we are setting there and whether they are tenable. But no one seems to be particularly worried there because you want the stock market to go up. Whereas with climate, you don't want the temperature to go up, so it's a little bit more shocking. But overall, I think as one of the, at least both other speakers will talk about, we actually as a society lay down quite a few principles for planning for these extremes, thinking that they'll happen 5 or 10% of the time. So when they start happening recurrently, that poses a new challenge, and that's the challenge that many of the societies aren't really ready for.
Jennifer, as frequencies, types, locations, and amplitudes of these extremes increased actually, did we adjust already in terms of our preparedness and response for that, or are we still sort of dabbling around, experiencing it, and not really sure what to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it really depends on the city. So if we're thinking about Phoenix, and then what's the extreme we're dealing with? If we're thinking about Phoenix, if we're thinking about extreme heat, how prepared are we for another 31-day period above 110 degrees Fahrenheit? And there's some people that are very prepared, and some sectors that are very prepared, and then there's some that are just not. And they haven't seen these extremes, they haven't managed these extremes, thinking agriculture, water, energy, and so forth. But I do know that the energy grid is quite resilient here, and Kelly can talk more about that. But it's great to hear something like that, but also be prepared for that what-if scenario. If the whole grid does go out, do we have a preparedness plan? In terms of that, I don't know for sure. I haven't been able to find anything exactly on if you have a widespread blackout across the county and valley, what's the plan? The same way that a city might have a preparedness plan for a hurricane evacuation. But what I do know is that if we're thinking about heat in Phoenix, most cities in the world are looking to Phoenix to learn what to do, to get answers, to understand what's happening in terms of adaptation, coping capacity, resilience. And that's really great, but we also have so much to understand around vulnerability and protecting those most at risk under these more intense events. And these same people would have been at risk under a 105 degree Fahrenheit heat wave. They're just a little bit more incrementally at risk under a 110 degree heat wave that's 31 days instead of 5 days. So it's shifting our mindset to think more about these longer, more intense periods of heat. And we might do similar things with other extremes that we see globally in other cities. But yes, we're not prepared for snow, we're prepared for heat, and other cities up north can say the opposite.
Just following up quickly on that, you said, there is the incremental, naturally, stress. Are there also some thresholds that, let's say, if we go above 125, 130 Fahrenheit, whatever, you can pick, where this is not just an increment, but where the system reaches a resonance and we have systemic failure?
So I can talk about that from a human physiological standpoint, in terms of what can the human body handle in terms of temperature, humidity, radiation exposure over a 3 or 6 hour period, and human survivability, and there is, but it depends on the person. We have diverse populations, and a lot of our research is trying to account for that better. Your age, where you are, is it humid, is it dry? And that means those thresholds change. And we get that question all the time. What's the threshold to survivability? And there is no threshold, even though every reporter wants that from us. There isn't. It's just too complex. The body's too complex. The globe is too complex. But we can give more nuanced thresholds for what we do see. And one thing we're trying to get people to think a little bit more of is that it's more than just survivability. So you don't want to just live in a place and only be able to lay there and potentially survive the day. You want to be able to play, live, work, and be healthy and thrive. And so thinking more about livability than just only yes or no survivability is really important when we're considering these extreme environments in places globally, and where do we want to live long term.
So Kelly, we are, in a way, we are a city living on the edge, both in terms of heat and water and other things. But these two are typically, when people talk about Phoenix, it's hot and, oh, you're running out of water.
Yeah.
So given the extremes that we saw, we talked about the 31 days, we also look at the water supply and dwindling water supplies. How much buffer do we have in the system?
Well, when I was at SRP, one of my responsibilities was resource planning and integrated system planning. So I was responsible for ensuring that the lights stay on and the AC runs during the summer. And I left SRP in May of last year. So I had my fingers crossed to see if our planning actually worked. And it did. We made it through the summer, as did APS and TEP. None of the utilities in the state had any outages associated with the heat. So that is great news. Arizona enjoys the highest reliability. The electric grid in Arizona enjoys the highest reliability of all 50 states. So we can rest somewhat assured. But don't get too complacent here, because I'm going to talk to you about really what was happening behind the scenes. So I've talked to a lot of my colleagues at all three of the utilities, so get ready for this panel. And essentially what they said was, if you think about it, it was 34 days of consecutive, but it was 54 days above 110. And from a utility perspective, what that means is that the electrical equipment never has a chance to cool down, and it's important for that equipment to cool down. So we heard a lot about above 110. We didn't hear as much about the fact that there were most evenings it never got below the low 90s as the low, right? So it's really stressful to the electric power system. So that is something we do need to keep in mind, and it would be a great research topic for folks here at ASU to work closely with the utilities to figure out what that threshold is. The utilities, in a couple of instances, were right at the ragged edge. So there were times where it wasn't clear to them where the megawatts were going to come from to keep the AC running and the lights on. The good news for all of us, and I'm sure you're familiar with this construct, but I apologize if it's too basic, but of course we're all interconnected in the Western Interconnect, and that's what kind of saves you in situations like this. So we were experiencing extreme heat in Arizona. Other parts of the West were not experiencing the same level of heat. So when we got to that ragged edge, we actually ended up, and I think this is kind of ironic, relying on California. I mean, you might recall in previous summers, the reverse was true, and California was relying on Arizona and its neighbors to provide additional capacity to get them through the summer. But I think the message I want you to take away from this is how close we are from a resource perspective to being in trouble. So you'll see the utilities, and you're seeing it already, they're adding resources. Lots of solar, lots of wind, some natural gas, to meet this kind of twin challenge of both growth, which is astronomical, quite frankly, in Arizona, and they're trying to do it at the same time as they're transitioning their resource portfolio. So it's a sensitive time for the electrical grid, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that we need to be mindful of the resilience and ensuring that we're supportive of what they're trying to do.
And probably, especially in a phase where we try to transition from conventional energy production with base loads to something that's much more renewable, but that's also has more complexity to it. And keeping the reliability while moving into a new system must add additional pressure on those who are responsible for providing steady power.
Yes, and I am a veteran of several battles about natural gas. SRP had to cite some natural gas plants while I was in that role, and it's a difficult argument because people think, well, we need to reduce fossil emissions, and we absolutely do, and I can assure you that the utilities are doing everything they can, but they do need to do it at a time when wind is intermittent, solar is intermittent, and you have to have a resource that can back that up. And our biggest priority is to try to close coal plants because they have the largest carbon emissions. And so natural gas is going to end up being a bridge for a while. And I know that's not a popular message to a lot of folks, but it's the reality of the system. And so I think people need to understand why you need to add that resource to the mix.
Mani, you worked in many parts of the world, and you worked on topics that included extreme conditions. From your perspective, looking around the globe, how well are we actually prepared to accept that we are going into an environment where we are into a future where we have more extremes, and how prepared are we at this point? And which parts of the world are better prepared for which reason?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So the typical way we divide this is into the global north and global south. But I think that's a misnomer, because one of the things I learned from working in Asia and Africa and Latin America is that many of the challenges that are faced in those developing contexts are actually true in many parts of the US as well. And this applies to both energy and water. And just to complement what Kelly was saying, February 2021, there was a major freeze in Texas, which was seen as unprecedented, but it was like something that happens on average about every 35, 40 years. Everything broke. The power systems broke because they had not designed things for that kind of a long duration deep freeze. As a result, the water systems broke, and so on and so forth, all the way through, and a bunch of people died. If that had happened in, say, Africa or India, that would have been treated as a normal outcome of something of that sort. But those kind of things are happening here. And I will say that my outlook for much of the United States in terms of resilience is not as optimistic as the picture presented in Phoenix with regard to the electric grid and the summer heating load. Overall, I would say that, a different way of looking at it is which places have new infrastructure versus old infrastructure. And in that sense, China, Korea probably come out way ahead, because they generally have much newer infrastructure, much greater range of sources that have been deployed. And so their potential resilience is higher, but even there, the population pressure would be a concern.
Jennifer, we talked about preparedness and, are there evacuation plans and things like that. I agree with you, there are probably not plans to the extent that we should have them. And if we would get into a situation where we have a heat wave at about 120 plus, and the power would fail, we probably would see even more heat-related deaths than we already see. Because we are actually, climatologically, Phoenix is the hottest city in the US and has the highest number of heat-related deaths each summer in the hundreds. Mm-hmm. So given that scenario then, and let's assume you cannot escape because everything has to go through Route 17, which is a real big bottleneck, what can be done for those who have to stay in place and have to really be exposed to extreme heat for, let's say, a few days?
Yeah. It's interesting because a paper came out this summer. I was not on the paper, but other ASU colleagues and colleagues from Georgia Tech were on the paper that modeled just that. What happens to the Phoenix population if we lose electrical or our power for a few days? And their estimates were that about half of the population would end up in the hospital seeking treatment. I forget the estimate of the number of deaths, but
almost 13,000.
Okay, there we go. So you know the paper, yeah. 13,000. I'm sure you got some calls about that paper, and so that paper did not model any adaptive capacity, any leaving, any social cohesion. And so when you think about it, if you turn off the ability to leave, then what do we have locally without power? We have each other, and that you really have to rely on social cohesion and your social fabric to come together and have a preparedness plan in your home, in your neighborhood, have some resource hubs. So some work happening at ASU in the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience is looking at resilience hubs that would be able to run on off the grid to be able to keep people safe and cool. And so having more of those ready is vital, not just for heat, but for any kind of extreme weather event where people would lose power, but you need somewhere indoors to go to survive. And so resilience hubs are a really good one, and that does depend a lot on community resilience, communities coming together, and having the support from emergency managers to do that. So I think that that's what I would kind of rely on, and just neighbors helping neighbors kind of is what would happen. And you see that a lot in extreme events globally. When a hurricane hits Puerto Rico, people have to come together to survive. So I think that's what we would need to rely on. And that is a really, really important component of adaptive capacity for any extreme.
So if so many people end up in the hospitals, but everybody is affected by heat, who is running the hospitals? Yeah,
so that's a really, so I don't know if anyone's ever looked at like how well, hospitals have generators, thankfully. Right. But so it should be cooler in the hospitals, but the hospitals wouldn't be able to handle that amount of people. And even this summer, some of the medical doctors we work with were comparing some of the situations in the emergency room to what it felt like during COVID. And not feeling prepared, not knowing what to do, kind of putting people who were overheated with very high core temperatures into body bags. They were alive, but filled with ice because you have to cool their temperature down. And that's something you don't, like, it's hard to envision, but they're doing that to keep them alive, put them in a body bag to keep them alive. And it worked, but that's the kind of, like, they had to think on their feet a lot about so many people coming in with the same situation. They didn't have enough resources for it on some of the days in July. How are they going to manage this? And it's figuring out how to be more prepared for situations like that. The 911 dispatches were up. More people calling, or more people not knowing when, like at a shelter, if someone comes in, when to call 911 for someone really struggling in the heat. And it's figuring out how to manage and educate and come together. So the emergency managers coming together with 911, coming together and talking to those managing all the shelters is really vital, that communication across all of these sectors to know what to do and when and how to do it and who to call and essentially then save some lives.
In your opinion, how well is that functioning today?
In some of our conversations with, let's say, shelters, they do have a lot of questions around what to do in that situation and when should they call 911 versus just kind of letting someone cool off. And I don't think they necessarily know. And then we do get, we're getting a lot more interest from emergency medical physicians wanting to learn more about the heat itself and what to do in those situations. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for knowledge exchange, and especially understanding, those at-risk populations, who they are, where they are, and why they are at risk. So we know from our morbidity and mortality reports that the county does that I think it was something like 60% of the deaths in 2022 were due to or related to substance use, and a lot of those were unhoused individuals. So that's really critical to understand and address, and the complexity of the heat problem is massive when you bring in social issues in our city and county. And how do we deal with the housing crisis? How do we deal with the fact that so many of the indoor deaths were due to people's air conditioning not working? So from paper, air conditioning is present, but in reality, air conditioner is not working, and they ended up not surviving the heat. And so that's just a couple examples of some of the intersecting factors that affect whether or not people are going to be able to survive during a heat wave here.
Kelly, coming back to utilities and how they actually prepare and build scenarios, often they actually use data that are climatologies of the past.
Right.
So how are they actually preparing for a changing environment looking forward? Are they doing that to the extent that they should, and how are they doing that, and how much buffer are they building in?
Yeah, they're just learning, I think, Peter, to do that. That was one of the big changes that we worked on in our planning and our forecasting, was to stop looking backwards, stop looking in the rearview mirror for weather data, and try to downscale the climate model so we better understand what we might be facing in the future. There's a lot of change that needs to happen at utilities to be responsive to what we're going to see, because not only do you have a situation where your service is so vital. I mean, we talked about this study that David Hondola participated in, where you would have 800,000 folks from just the city of Phoenix, not the metropolitan area, but 800,000 people from the city of Phoenix would need medical attention, and there are 3,000 hospital beds available. And then the death toll was close to 13,000. So it's something that we have to ensure just doesn't happen, right? It's not something we can plan for or hope to we have to ensure that it doesn't happen, and it's so critical that we get it right. So we do have to use better weather data. We do have to understand the impact of the heat on the current system and whether the transformers can withstand day after day of this. The other thing that the utilities are doing is they're looking at joining energy markets, so that you could better connect to the other states so that you can utilize their capacity. That doesn't always work, though. How many of you remember the summer of 2020, which was a really hot summer as well? Remember that one? In that case, recall that the heat dome actually sat on top of the entire West. And so it wasn't just a Phoenix situation or an Arizona situation. Oregon was hot, Denver was hot, San Francisco was hot. And so in that case, the margins were very, very slim because everybody needed whatever excess they had. So I think one way to do this is to build out of the system. So we're going to have to add, as I mentioned before, new renewables, more battery storage. You're just going to have to add more resources to the mix, but you also then need to plan for what the system of the future is going to have to withstand, because you have to get it right. It's not an option to not get it right. I mean, think about what you would have done this summer if you would have been without power for any length of time.
Manu, we are seeing quite a few extremes in environment, but we are also seeing extremes in other parts of the Earth system, in society. Societal instability around the globe is increasing. What is the impact of these uncertainties in societal dynamics on dealing with extremes that are hitting our life-supporting systems?
Yeah, there's probably a two-way interplay. So many people argue that the climate events are inducing migration. However, if you look at the scale with which there's in-migration coming into the United States and into Europe from different countries, and it's not just the border countries for those regions, you have to wonder if there is not an organized social dynamic that is motivating people to do that, because many of these people are not necessarily the ones most at risk. Many are, but many are also people who are using this as a conduit to migrate to better opportunities. The politics of that is just as interesting, because in many countries it's inflaming anti-immigrant policies or anti-sectarian policies. And the question then becomes that if you have a climate extreme that actually leads to an increase in the refugee load because of those reasons, does the combination of these two dynamics lead to a flashpoint? And I think this is something we have to be watchful for, but has not quite happened to the degree that one could see a global sort of catastrophe emerging from.
I think it's one of these examples where the holistic look at the system is important, where focusing too much on one or the other will miss the major part of this overall dynamics. Jennifer, coming back to how are we actually working as a society? How well is academia actually working with stakeholders, and how is that perceived by them?
By the stakeholders?
Yeah.
I feel like it depends on the stakeholder you're working with. There's some stakeholders that will say, please come help us, we really need your expertise on this issue. And then there's others that kind of we're trying to see, like, can we work with you? And it really depends. What I have found since I came to ASU in 2018 is how amazing our stakeholder networks are, especially in the world I work within, in extreme heat, and working with the city of Tempe, the city of Phoenix, city of Mesa, city of Scottsdale. And a lot of that is spurred on by some of the work that has gone on in GFL because of, you know, how, like, the history of that we've built and the trust we've built over the long term of working with Tempe and so forth. So I really like working with stakeholders. I learn a lot working with stakeholders. I also work with schools a lot, and you kind of need to do that to be able to understand what the real world looks like, and why certain things will not work in that system. Why can't we plant that tree there? And there's so many reasons why you can't. And you have to learn that before you are going to do a model of, like, where you can put trees and what that means for the environment. Because you just can't put trees everywhere. You can't paint all the streets white. You can't paint all the roofs white. There's so many limitations to some of these, like, sexy sounding technologies for heat, but you have to work with the stakeholders to understand the real world. And I really appreciate having that transdisciplinary, multi-sectorial perspective in my position, and then it allows me to get this context and this nuance around what's possible, for sure. But I mean, I'm learning every day, and then I feel like just even then working across disciplines within ASU is exciting too. So.
Do you think you have the impact that you aspire to, or do you think there are still some impedances in the system that keep you from doing what you envision you would like to do?
I feel like there's lots of impedances in the system. I don't know if others agree, but there's always going to be rules and regulations that you have this really brilliant idea, but it's just not going to work because a certain rule or regulation exists, and maybe that'll change, but it's, I think, understanding those and then working within the system you're part of. And so how can I understand, you know, why a school can't make a change to their recess when it's 110 degrees Fahrenheit out? You have to talk to people to figure out those nuances and then come together and work with them to find, like, what would a solution look like for that specific school or that classroom. And it just varies so much, and so it's hard to even apply what we learn in Phoenix to other cities for the most part because of those more socio-cultural nuances. And then even in some of our work on extreme heat, what we have here in Phoenix and the way people use cooling centers in Phoenix looks completely different in a place like Montreal, where no one uses the cooling centers for some reason, but here cooling centers save lives. And so it's trying to understand those contexts and then working with researchers globally, and not just researchers, but the public health agencies, the city governments, and so forth, to understand, like, what are their biggest and pressing concerns, and then in that way your research can potentially actually make a difference versus just kind of sitting in a paper that no one might read. So it's really exciting to be trying to move forward to things like that. It might take 20 years, who knows, but I think some of this can be incremental, and you might get some successes here, and then others might take 10 years to see to fruition. And that's okay.
Hopefully not 20 years.
No, yeah.
Kelly, on that topic, are stakeholders, for example utilities, but stakeholders in general, expecting more or different information and input from academia? And how open are they actually to that input that we are providing?
Well, I think utilities and others are very open to help, right? I mean, as I've pointed out to you, it is a tough time to be in the utility business because you do have this really important requirement to transition your resource portfolio, to move it as quickly as you can, to decarbonize it as quickly as you can. At the same time, you're dealing with this heat and you're also dealing with the growth. And so I think they're very open to ideas on how to do that and do that successfully. They're very good at partnering. And you know, when I was talking with my colleagues about last summer, like, how did you get through it? They pointed out a couple of things which I think are really important. One, they talked about the fact, and this is very helpful, is that all of the equipment actually operated when they needed it to. So we all know how difficult that is. A lot of the generating units are old, and you know, it's just, you sort of hope that they will get through extreme heat like that, and they did. But the other key thing, and it kind of goes to something that Jen was talking about, and that is How many of you have participated in the reward programs from the utilities where they operate your thermostat during peak times? So you all participated and helped in a really tough time. So there were about 130 megawatts for APS and about 160 megawatts for SRP of load that did not need to be met because people turned their thermostats up, or they had them turned up by Nest, and then they didn't go back and turn them out. But one of the issues that they saw, though, is that customers got fatigued with the idea after a while, right? So after day 3 of that, you're like, it's hot, I really, really want to just kind of cool off a little bit. So we'll have to think about getting more people enrolled and work with the university to try to figure out how to get more people to raise their hand and be part of a community spirit when something like this happens. And then we also need to be focusing on overnight heat and what that will do to the electric system and how we can prepare for that.
So final round of questions, the same questions for all three of you, starting with Manu. Of course, the mission of the Global Futures Lab is to get engaged in these issues and to show options for moving in this difficult environment. Are we actually doing enough? And if not, what should we do differently?
So, Peter, I think I have a strange view of this whole situation in some ways. We are doing too much that is not useful, and we are not doing enough in terms of actually doing some things. And I'm talking about the academic community at large, because at the moment I have a limited understanding of the work at GFL. But what I see is a lot of effort to generate scenarios for the future, which are disconnected from the dynamics of the overall integrated system. I don't see people that are actually getting into working with others, as contrary to the examples that you're presenting. So maybe GFL is doing an amazing job relative to the rest of academia in that sense, with local engagement. But I think in terms of the larger picture, where people are meeting in COP or Davos or in the world stage, we are not really as well focused, academia as well as policymakers, on how we can achieve resilience immediately and where the help is needed, which communities need help, and how to prioritize how to do that.
And if you would have a choice of the most important thing that you think that should be changed, what would it be in academia?
Yeah, so I think that, at least from my experience, what I've found is that many people in academia see the business sector as evil. However, most of the country actually runs because the private sector exists, and the private sector works closely with the public sector to make things happen. So we have to understand the dynamics of how those things work, and we have to see where the entry points are that can then lead to a societal transformation. I don't think we can sit back and pontificate on these things. And this is similar to what Jennifer was saying. You have to understand what the rules are. But beyond the rules, we have to understand how the dynamics across those systems in the real world work. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge, because no one is typically evaluating you in academia for that. They want to see the papers, but the papers never actually discuss practically what is needed.
Kelly, how do you look at that?
Well said, Manu. I've only been here, as I mentioned, a little more than a couple months. And Peter brought me in, I think, to do exactly what Manu was just talking about, is to first understand all the great work that's happening at GFL, and then try to translate it to people in the community who could actually use it. And that's an important part of my job. The second, probably more important part of my job from my perspective, is to actually be out in the community asking what the challenges are and what the opportunities are, and bring that back and try to match that with what's happening in GFL so that we can work together to have an impact. Because as Manu said, business is not evil. They're trying to do the right thing. They just need to know which of the folks at GFL can help them get to where they need to be. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do.
Jennifer, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree fully. And it's interesting to think about the world of academia and how we're evaluated. And then how hard that can make it to do the longer term trust building, community-based work, working with industry and so forth. And I feel like ASU is one of the institutions across the nation that's pushing more into providing, in your evaluations, especially in our School of Sustainability, I know we do this, it is really good and it's expected that you are doing some form of community engagement. That doesn't mean everyone coming in knows how to do that or has training in that, though. So there could be value in making sure that there's training, and I've had some of my colleagues in climate science say, we're like not at ASU, but we're expected to do research on environmental justice, but how do you do that? And where do I get that training? And they recognize you can't just do that. Like it's a sensitive thing. And so if a lot of us want to do that where that wasn't part of our training, could there be a way forward with that? And another thing I think about in my work outside of academia and working with stakeholders is just this fact that like we spend months applying to these big grants that we may or may not get. And it's very tough to include communities on those grants. In practice, it's tough to take money from the university and give it to communities, the ones who really, really need it and are going to make stuff happen on the ground. And it would be great to see more mechanisms to be able to support communities, support people working on the ground to improve resilience and adaptive capacity across all these spheres we're talking about today. And that's this barrier I've seen a lot in any institution I've worked with to be able to make that shift, that change in the real world versus just having the research stay here. And that can go for working with industry and government as well, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so let's open up for a few questions from the audience. I think there is a microphone circulating. I see somebody here to the left. I was at a meeting where they actually had a very interesting way to distribute microphones. They packed them into little foam things and just threw them. And funny as it sounds, it worked wonderfully. Oh, wow. All these back and forth, transaction times were cut down. So we have to think about that. Being innovative, the innovative university, we should probably think about these things.
Yeah.
So my comment is about this innovative university, and I just want to take off on what Jenny was just saying. The NSF, for instance, is in a lot of their newer calls, is interested in seeing academics work with communities. And I know what you're talking about. It is extremely difficult at this university to pay our partners to work with us. And I think that there's a will both by the funder and by the researchers to see that happen, and this university needs to figure out how to make that happen and not put up barriers for people to actually be able to pay others. And that's if this is the innovative university, then let's be at the forefront of actually making it worthwhile for our community partners to work with the university and to give the value that they do.
Great point. Other questions? Over here. Oh, Ed.
Hey, Peter. Just a quick comment and just asking for a reaction to. I think the truth of the matter is that most people who are really affected last year in the heat waves and so on are low income and homeless people, right? I mean, we're talking about the people who are most vulnerable since we're talking about communities. So the not adaptive infrastructure, but adaptive measures cost money. If you don't have a house, you're not going to have air conditioning. Mm-hmm. You could have air conditioning, but I think Arizona is probably on the top half tier of electricity costs, not at the lowest tier. So it costs money. So the question is, what are your reactions about how we're going to be prepared for this, for those considerations? Because those of us in this room could afford to do a lot of things that we need to do to adapt to a changing environment.
Yeah, it's a great point. Can I?
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
there's been some work done in the scope of sustainability by Melissa Guardaro, and she interviewed numerous community members across the county, and people fall into 3 buckets. Heat is an inconvenience. That's kind of what you were talking about for a lot of us in the room. It's just this inconvenience in our day, and we know we're going to an air-conditioned home, an air-conditioned car, an air-conditioned office. For another part of the population, it's managed throughout the summer, where they're trying to make sure that they can pay for that air conditioning to stay on, or cutting budgets in other places like food to keep the AC on. And then for a large pocket of our population, the most vulnerable, it's a disaster, and it is life or death. And those 2 last pockets, especially the third, are the ones where we can focus a lot of our resources and our solutions, where we need to be thinking about what are those other factors beyond air temperature, because air temperature doesn't matter when you're not housed. 105 to 110, it's not a big difference if you're not housed. It's a disaster. And so how can we be looking at adaptive capacity in those spaces? For sure. And then there was something else you said that I wanted to comment on, and now I can't remember. It'll come to me.
It will come back. Any other questions? Yep.
So I actually had a comment. On Jenny's point and to the point that Nancy made, in terms of working with the community, yes, there's the funding issue, but I think what we have in spades at here is also platforms like the Sustainable Cities Network, the Project Cities, award-winning, that have over almost 20 years built relationship with the cities, 40 cities here, and through working groups, they have become this platform to communicate the science and the research that faculty do here. So I think the working group, one has on extreme heat, there's on climate and resilience, there are multiple. I was with the group for 10 years. So the cities have a problem in that sense that they are limited staff, limited resources. So there's only so much that they can do. So we can't just give them, say, this is the information. They say, we don't have time to read your paper. We don't have time. So we rely on EPA, and what EPA sometimes is 10 years old. So that gap between the city, the research that we do and the implementation is huge, and it hasn't been resolved. So the university, we could step in to do that, and a lot of work that Jenny and others are doing are great. But I think what is really important is that right now the platform is only being used at a student level, like for research work at students. So that platform is underutilized in terms of what our faculty and our researchers can do to reach the communities. And I think that platform is award-winning, respected by the community. It's also established, and it delivers. And I think if we can create a little bit more platforms like that, then I think we have a much greater way of building bridges, and we don't have to create something new. And innovative practices still exist. We just have to optimize it a little bit further. Thank you.
Yeah, great comment. Let's take one more question.
When it comes to grid resilience, how are utility companies transitioning with renewables when it comes to storage inefficiency, and how is this challenge of balancing the grid in times of uncertain extremes?
Well, one of the things I'd like to do is spend some time aggregating what all of the utilities are doing together so that people would have a better sense of the road that the utilities are on. So, for example, I believe that some of the most aggressive climate reduction or carbon reduction goals in the state are owned by the utilities. It's kind of a little known secret, but APS, for example, is going to be zero carbon by 2050. SRP and TEP are net zero by 2050, and all 3 of the utilities have interim goals. TEP is an 80% reduction by 2030. APS is a 65% clean energy goal by 2035, and SRP is a 75% reduction by 2035. So they're on the glide path, is my point, and they're actually adding quite a bit of renewables. I was looking at their integrated resource plans for all 3 of the utilities, and there are thousands, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of megawatts of solar, battery storage, wind, and then this natural gas. And I know natural gas sometimes can land on people and make them uncomfortable, and I just want to explain that it's a different kind of a technology. These are quick start engines. They're like airline engines, and they run for a very short amount of time, maybe 10% of the entire year, but when you need them, You turn them on and you get past peak, and then you turn them off. So it's kind of an all of the above strategy, but the utilities are definitely on a glide path to make it happen. They unfortunately have to operate in a fairly polarized political environment. And so I think it's hard for them sometimes to maintain these fierce commitments to carbon reduction, and so I think it's something we ought to be mindful of. And they're trying to do that at the same time as they're ensuring reliability. So it's a tough spot to be in.
So that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you, Kelly, Jennifer, Manu. Thank you all for attending and for your questions. And we will have several of these throughout the year, and we will let you know in advance when the next one will be on which topic. So thanks, everybody.